coming to you from the shores of gorgeous Lake Michigan. This is home to passionate book lovers. Hosting more than 270 acclaimed authors in 14 years, including best-selling novelists Geraldine Brooks, Ann Patchett, and Mitch Albom. We are live at the historic City Opera House in downtown Traverse City, Michigan. Welcome to the National Writers Series. Tonight, a conversation with best-selling novelist Paula Hawkins and her new book, The Blue Hour, with guest host Doug Stanton, also a New York Times best-selling author and NWS co-founder. The National Writers Series couldn't do this without our amazing audience, dedicated volunteers, and talented authors.
I love NWS!
We are also raising writers with Battle of the Books and free writing classes to 3rd through 12th grade students across the region.
Thank you, NWS!
Tonight's event is presented to you by White Dog Black Tie, only at the Painted Bird. A special thanks to our media partners, Interlochen Public Radio and the Traverse City Record Eagle. We'd also like to thank our other sponsors, including the Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology, Golden Fowler Furnishings, West Shore Bank, Ward and Mary Bevins Gillette, Cordia, and the Cherry Capital Airport. And now, NWS co-founder and executive director Ann Stanton will introduce tonight's event.
Hello, everybody. And with me at the lectern is Clark Bunting, our chairman of the NWS board. So good evening. It is great to see all of you here tonight. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Writers Series, we host best-selling authors from all over the country, tonight from the world, and bring them to the City Opera House throughout the year, instead of just 1 week. Tonight, we are delighted to have Paula Hawkins here. As all of you know, she's the #1 New York Times best-selling author of Girl on the Train, which sold more than 23 million copies to her great shock and was made into a major motion picture. And Clark will tell you a little bit more.
Okay. Paula is here to talk about her new novel, The Blue Hour, which will be published tomorrow in the US. The Blue Hour is impossible to put down. It's a story of obsession and identity, told in masterful prose, winding along a number of very mysterious paths, and I think it's a great book for a Halloween week. The cool thing is that everyone sitting here tonight will be among the very first to get that book before the book's publication. And for those of you who bought a live stream ticket, your copy will soon be on its way to you as well. So we're very excited. It's very, very cool that we're able to get Paula here tonight and before the book's even out.
So, Paula will be here in conversation with Doug Stanton, a guy I know well. He's a #1 New York Times bestselling author of In Harm's Way and 12 Strong, which was also made into a movie. Before we bring Paula and Doug onto the stage, I'd like to take a moment to express our gratitude. Tonight's event is taking place on lands cherished for generations by the indigenous people of this area. We wish to recognize the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians who still reside here. Thank you. And now, please welcome Doug and Paula to the stage. Thanks for coming.
Hi.
Welcome, Paula. Thank you for being in Traverse City at the National Writers Series. We're very thrilled to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
You've enjoyed town a bit, haven't you?
I have. I had yesterday to wander about and look at bookstores and do a bit of shopping, and it's been lovely.
You've just arrived from, you're from England or from Scotland?
Yeah, well, both. I flew in from London on Saturday.
Yeah. Well, we're very privileged to have you as you kick off your North American book tour for this wonderful novel called And as Clark and Ann said, it publishes tomorrow. So it's in the lobby right here now. I have lots of questions, lots of interesting things that your book has stimulated for me to think about. But I want you to tell us here in the elevator pitch what the Blue Hour is about. Just set the stage for our audience before we begin.
So The Blue Hour is a psychological suspense novel. It is set on a remote tidal island off the west coast of Scotland. And this island is home to just one house, one inhabitant. There's only one way out. And it was once home to an artist, a woman called Vanessa Chapman, who lived there for many years. And when the book opens, Vanessa is dead. That's not a spoiler. She's dead. And there is an exhibition of, including some of her work, at a gallery in London. And one of the pieces in the exhibition is a sculpture made up of found objects, including pebbles and wood and bone and other things. And a forensic pathologist who happens to be visiting the museum that weekend notices that the bone in the sculpture is not an animal bone. It's human. And so the curator of the museum that owns the sculpture has to play detective. And he has to go to the island where Vanessa used to live, and there he encounters her dear friend and companion, a woman called Grace. And together they form this sort of uneasy alliance as they try and dig into Vanessa's past and to find out where the bodies are buried, so to speak.
What is the Blue Hour, both in the book and really?
Well, the Blue Hour is that time of day after the sun has set, or indeed before it rises, when the sun is not in the sky, but there's light in the sky. There's that beautiful blue light. And it's a time of day when energy kind of shifts and animals move around and predators come out. And it's also a time where it's quite easy to mistake one thing for another. There's a line in the book where one of the characters talks about mistaking a wolf for a dog or an enemy for a friend. So it's all about times at which you might misperceive something and might get something wrong.
It seems to me that the book really is about boundaries and trespass for those boundaries and who's writing the story. And you don't know until the very end, really, kind of who's coming out on top in this book. I'd like to read something and ask just a quote from it, and then I'll have you read something. But I just found this fascinating, and it might be a theme that's running through, especially the Girl on the Train. And everyone's almost read that book, right? The Girl on the Train? Yeah. Okay. What's amazing about Paula Hawkins' work is the level of prose at which it's operating, both at a stylistic level, kind of at a musical level, and then at a narrative level to keep you turning the pages. It's quite a feat. Here is an excerpt from, she's not the protagonist, but tell us briefly who Vanessa Chapman is before I read this.
So Vanessa is the artist. She's the woman who lived on this island, and although she's gone, her presence kind of looms large over the book. We know her through the people who knew her and loved her. So she's kind of at the heart of the book without ever actually appearing in it herself. We hear her voice through her diaries and letters and that kind of thing, but she's not actually around anymore.
And she really raises some themes which I see running through your book, is the theme of feminism and the women's voices and women's place in story, especially if you look at Girl on the Train, if you begin there, the erasure that keeps happening with Rachel, no one believing her, etc. And so Vanessa writes, women aren't supposed to look, are they? They're supposed to be looked at. And if they see something violent or ugly or frightening, they're supposed to cover their eyes and swoon. They're supposed to flinch. They're supposed to look away. They're not supposed to move closer, to narrow their eyes and peer to examine and observe and appraise. They're not supposed to make a horror of something of their own. It's very powerful writing first, but could you talk about that for a moment, that sentiment about what is Vanessa Chapman looking at, or what is she not supposed to be looking at?
Yeah, I guess the the book is all about seeing and being seen, and she's a woman who's frustrated by the way she's been portrayed by critics who tend to focus on her appearance, her own physical appearance, but also on the fact that she's not always pleasing. She doesn't smile and make nice. So as a result, she's called difficult and prickly and all sorts of things, when actually she's frustrated with the fact that they won't just look at the work and appraise the work. And she's also got this thing that, yes, she sort of bridles against the fact that so much. And I was thinking, she's working mostly in the 1990s, and I was thinking about the way women in the public eye were written about, and the way they were appraised, and how much focus was put on their physical appearance rather than what they did or said or created. And so, I mean, that's a lot of what she's talking about. But there's also this feeling that women aren't supposed to, she's saying they're not supposed to look at horror or terrible things and look closer. You're supposed to be, protect me from this. And yet women suffer violence all the time, and why shouldn't they also peer closely at these things and ask questions of these things and portray these things? And when she's writing about that, she's talking about looking at a particular painting, which is the Artemisia Gentileschi, the Italian painter's picture of Judith beheading Holofernes, which is a very violent painting in which two women work together to cut a man's head off. And it's really powerful and extraordinary, and that's what she's talking about, and that's what she's taking inspiration from.
She's not a very likable person. Is that by your own admission, not mine? And we've talked about that, but that's not important to you, is it?
No, likability isn't important to me. That's not what it's not what I think about when I'm creating character. I don't think, will people like this person? That's not what they're there for. I think it's odd anyway to come to crime novels for characters you're going to like. Presumably you've got to dislike at least some of them. So, but in any case, that's not what's interesting, is it? What compels you is somebody who's, what compels me is somebody who's unusual and who is probably flawed. I mean, who isn't flawed? The flaws, I guess, are sometimes exaggerated because you're seeing people in extremis, aren't you? You're seeing them and when they're angry and afraid and in difficult situations, hence the crime part of the whole thing. So, yeah, she's not easy, certainly, and she does things. She can be selfish. She's very devoted to her work. She wants to make her mark in the world, and she's sort of taken this particular path where she's abandoned her feckless, annoying husband and gone off to live on this island by herself where she can just commit herself to her work. So she at times appears selfish and single-minded, but actually I quite admire that in her, and I can see the attraction of it, and I can see why somebody might want to live that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Slow Fire Burning, another novel, and Into the Water, you both there's some wonderful passages just about what happens to women who stick their neck out or step out of line. And it seems to be, it's a recurring idea or plot line in your novels. And with Vanessa, I wondered if you would read this passage. We won't tell you where it comes in the book, but it is really, I'd love to hear it in your own voice.
Is this the one we talked about?
Yep.
Okay. This is going to be tricky because I have to juggle
Oh, you do?
several things. But I can. All right. So, this is a section from Vanessa Chapman's diary. I didn't think to stay so long. I thought it would be a few years, a decade at most. Back then, I thought I had all the time in the world. I thought I had a lifetime. I did, I suppose. It just turns out to be rather a short one. The Glasgow doctor had nothing good to say. In the car on the way back, I thought about the first time I ever crossed over, the first time I saw the house I bought sight unseen. I was so brave then. and so young. For the first time in forever, I thought about that clipping that arrived, the one that I was sure was sent by a friend, but which no one ever owned up to. It suddenly came to me. Julian, of course it was Julian, trying to get rid of me, giving me a gentle shove. He of all people would have known what it was I'd be unable to resist. Poor Julian, he sealed his own fate. Grace was out when I got back to the island, so I went up to the studio and cried and raged alone. I feel so cheated. I wanted to burn the whole place to the ground. I never could, of course. So, a short life. Not always a happy one, but free. I've been free here on my island. I escaped the drudgery of domesticity, the violence of men. I worked with my hands, loved fiercely with my body. Thank God. Thank God I realized in the nick of time that I didn't want to live the life that was expected of me. Thank God I bolted. Thank God I ran. Thank God for my island, for Eris. Now that my hope, once violent, is a small and pitiful thing, I need to be practical. I need to consider what happens after I'm gone. Part of me bridles. What does it matter? A life is not a collection of things, after all. What does it matter what we leave behind, since the waves crash on, relentless, oblivious? What does it matter when one day, probably not too long from now, this island will be under the sea, and the house too, and the rock, and all the bones beneath it? Somehow it does. It matters what you leave behind. The art you made, or the people, the friends you loved, the good you did, the bad, it matters.
Wow. That's like listening to Stairway to Heaven. You just want to play it over again. That's beautiful. Do you like reading your own stuff? Do you do it much?
I read a little bit. Sometimes it's good to read it, sometimes not.
When you wrote that, that voice, it's just coming so naturally and kind of rolling. We talked about voice earlier today. Tell me a moment about that.
Well, I knew her well by then. That's, I think, for me, the important thing about character is knowing them really well. Well, that's how you get the voice, is if you really understand the person, so you've lived with them in your head for a while. This is how it works for me. I think of someone and I think about them and I think about them and I think about who they are and I think about where they come from. And origin stories are always a thing for me. I always want to think about what was their childhood like, and did they come from money, or was it hard, and were they bullied at school, and all these things that you imagine go into making a person, all the experiences and the hurts or the victories or whatever that go into making a person who they are. That's what tells you how they're going to respond to something, and that's the stuff that I like to think about for ages. And then I put pen to paper, and by that time, hopefully, you understand them a bit. So then the voice does start to come more naturally. Although I still I had to work on it, because I think she was feeling a bit old-fashioned to me. I think it's because I'd been reading a lot of books about artists, and the artists I was reading were actually a bit, earlier, a bit, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before. So
this was for research?
Yeah, so I read a memoir by a painter called Celia Paul, she's still alive, but she's older than Vanessa. She's famous. She ought to be famous for her extraordinary paintings. She's mostly famous because she was one of Lucian Freud's muses. And I read a biography of Barbara Hepworth, the British sculptor, and I was reading lots about artists, and their voices were maybe rattling around in my head a bit. So that's, that also goes into it.
Why I wanted you to read that section is I wonder what's at stake, because it really seems to be almost a thesis statement. It matters. Art matters. And now you don't have to. Now I know you kind of jumped into the middle of that audience, and if you don't want to read the book after hearing that, then you're not really a reader at all. So, but that's what the book is like. It's filled with this luscious kind of mystery. But she comes down hard on the idea that art matters. Do you feel that way? Do you feel that that's part of your journey as an author and a storyteller, that what you leave behind in these books matters? And how does it matter for you?
I mean, I think it's tricky when you talk about her own work. I'm not sure that, well, it's quite difficult to talk about writing crime novels as creating art, perhaps, maybe one day. But I do think art matters, and I do think that fiction matters in the way in which it allows us to walk in the shoes of other people, and it allows us to, see the stories of so many different kinds of people, and it allows us to empathize even with people who are really not very likable. And so, in that sense, I think fiction matters. In terms of, I do, and I think that yes, art is one of the things that makes life interesting and bearable when other things are so unbearable. So yeah, I do think it matters.
What's unbearable?
Well, if you look at the front pages of the newspapers or the internet or wherever we look. And yeah, and I'm not, globally, things are not great.
You don't mean just in Traverse City? No. Because we have a zoning issue that we haven't worked out. But
yeah, so what would we do without culture?
Well, you just made me think of we talked earlier today about the Goya paintings, the black paintings. I can only imagine when they were composed, and I want you to speak about what it was like to be in the room with them, that people didn't think they were art. So I wouldn't make that call yet on your novel. Yeah, I know what you're saying though, but.
Yes. I have no idea actually what the reception of the Goyas was at the time, but yeah, so I don't know if any of you have been to Madrid.
Amazing stuff.
To the Prado, and there is this room of Goya's black paintings, which were paintings he painted at a very dark time in his life, and they're horrifying and frightening. And there's one particular, it's a huge canvas, and it's almost entirely black, and it's called A Drowning Dog, and it's just the dog's head above water, and it's terrifying, and that really stayed with me, and I think about it a lot. And it's just one of those very clear art memories that you have when you see something and you just keep thinking about it and you want to look at it again, even though it's horrible, even though there's a part of you that wants to flinch from it, to look at the paint and look at how he did it and how he created this terrifying atmosphere.
People would say the same things about reading some of your stuff. It has that allure. What is that? What is it about the campfire of the terrifying story that we want to draw up to on our hands, and squat down and listen to? I know that you've said, give me a good trauma, give me a good tragedy. You like that stuff, right?
I do, and I'm not really sure why, but I am drawn to those kinds of stories, and so many of us are. I mean, there are lots of different aspects of this, I think, because there are on a basic level, people like a mystery. You like to be able to solve a mystery, to try and figure out who done it. There's that kind of aspect of it. There's the joy of being scared, the joy of the jump scare that you get. I mean, because you don't get jump scares in books, but the same anticipation that something bad is about to happen, you just don't know what it is. And there is a thrill in that, in the anticipation of something like that. But there are all sorts of ways, I think, in which crime novels can get at the heart of things, because the stakes are so high, aren't they, in a crime novel? It's literally, backs to the wall, blood on the carpet stuff. So that the conflict is built in, so there's that very sort of serious drama going on, which is, and it gives us a way, perhaps in a safe space, to figure out how we would respond to things and to explore to some degree how we feel about our fears. And our angers and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. That phrase, what is it? Entre loup et chien, between wolf and dog. Mm-hmm. That idea that you're going to transmogrify into something that becomes a friend or an enemy. It should be a shapeshifter, mm-hmm. which maybe is what a storyteller is in a certain way, to slip into another skin. Could you talk a minute about your life as a reporter and confronting the world as a news reporter and how that might have informed your storytelling.
Well, I was not, I was not a particularly exciting news reporter. My dream when I was a teenager was to be a foreign correspondent. However, I never achieved that quite, and I would have been a terrible foreign correspondent. I would have been so frightened all the time. But the first job I ever got in journalism was with a financial magazine, and this was in the 90s, and the focus of this magazine was Eastern Europe. And so this was not long after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the wall coming down and all that. And so there was kind of a gold rush in Eastern Europe where all the, American banks, European banks were going in and buying up assets, and there was privatizations going on. And anyway, so I as a cub reporter, I was like 22 or whatever, was sent to Romania and Bulgaria and Ukraine and all these places where I went to interview very learned people, and I didn't know what I was doing. But it was really interesting being thrown in at the deep end like that, having to, find your feet, that was a strange place to try and work as a young woman in that time, when there was a clear power differential between me and the people I was talking to, and there were some hairy moments.
What was one of the hairy moments?
Well, there was things like staying in hotels where the doors didn't lock and there were unsavory people outside and that kind of thing. And just being utterly unprepared for it. And this was I want to say pre-internet. I guess the internet existed, but nobody used it. And I didn't have a credit card. And you would just be sort of launched out there. So the whole thing felt precarious. But it was interesting. It really was. And seeing these places at this time that everything was changing and everything seemed up for grabs. It had that slightly kind of Wild West vibe to it. So I did that. And then I got a probably much more boring job at the Times of London, where I wrote about business and finance and that kind of thing. And what I took from it, though, mostly was, it does teach you to write. Journalism teaches you to write. It teaches you not to be afraid of the blank page. You just get on with it because you have to, because there's a deadline in 3 hours, and you don't have time to wait for the muse to visit you. You just write, and you learn to edit yourself, and you learn to get to the heart of the story, to strip out all the stuff that's not necessary and really nail it in that first paragraph. And you learn to listen to what people are telling you, and you learn to listen for what they're not telling you as well, that I think is a very interesting thing, particularly when you're writing a crime novel, because so much of what you're doing is trying to hide things. So you get that ear for dialogue and for the way people speak and for the kinds of things that people say when they're sort of giving you the runaround. So all of that stuff was incredibly helpful.
This career in journalism comes after you've moved from Zimbabwe, where you moved when you were 17, right, to London, which is a very interesting, it had to be shocking. As you point out, the wall has fallen, Ceausescu is about to be executed in Romania, the IRA is bombing in the UK, there's riots, the Tuesbury riots, so you've come from a very placid 1950s kind of environment in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia and been plunked down in London. And what did that do to your sense of identity or your sense of feeling who you were?
Yeah, it was a shock. It was a culture shock. I mean, I'd visited England, London, and other places in the UK as a child, but to come at that point in your life, so I was 17, it was destabilizing. It took me a while to find sort of my people and to fit in. I was very lonely. There was that sense that persists, I think, that I no longer really was Zimbabwe and I didn't belong there, and yet I didn't feel British particularly either. I'd always held a British passport because my dad was born in England, although he never really lived there. But so it was that feeling of outsiderness that definitely it was incredibly useful later when I was writing about it, and I think persists to some degree, that you don't quite feel that you fit in one place or the other.
When were you writing about it? I mean, when you say it was useful later when you were writing about it.
Yeah, because all of the characters, the protagonists, are always outsiders. They're always people who don't quite fit. They're always people who've struggled with loneliness and with making connections, and who've and so I go back to that and I draw on that, and I remember how I felt, that sort of on the outside looking in, so close that you could touch it but you can't, not being able to, sort of not quite getting the joke or what have you, that sort of stuff. And you go back to that and use that again and again, I think.
Is it cultural, social, financial, or what?
I think it is cultural and social. It was for me in any case. It just takes a while. And I think it's also that, probably that, moving at that time, at that point in your life, it's very easy to knock out of your stride when you're 17, and you don't have a proper sense of who you are anyway, do you? Well, some 17-year-olds might, but I didn't. I was still one of those people who was like casting around for who I was really going to be. And so we talked about that sort of the shape-shifting thing, and I've said this before, but when I moved to London, I started speaking with a nice British accent, because my accent at the time was a Zimbabwean accent, which sounds like a South African accent. And so everyone thought I was a South African, and everybody hated white South Africans in 1989 with some justification. So it was just one more thing that I had to sort of get rid of. Yeah, so now I sound like a kind of posh English person, which I'm not.
Right, in fact, you quit reporting in 2009, if I have my dates correct, roughly.
Around that, yeah.
And you're going to become a writer now. You're going to start writing books. And now we're getting to the part about how the girl on the train is born and brought into the world, which is a fascinating story, to go from being a financial reporter. So take us through this moment when let me ask it this way. Who is Amy Silver?
Amy Silver was another alter ego of mine. So I was I had become somewhat disillusioned with journalism, and I was sort of withdrawing from it and freelancing more, and I wasn't on staff anymore. I had an agent because I'd written a non-fiction book, and she approached me saying that there was a publisher who wanted somebody to write a rom-com set against the backdrop of the global financial crisis. 2008. Yeah. And so that they had kind of an idea for a character and a sort of scenario. So an editor had sort of spotted a gap in the market, and they just wanted someone to do it because no one had given them this book. So they sent me away, gave me about 8 weeks to write this novel about this girl who's fallen on hard times, woman who's fallen on hard times. And they approached me because they thought I understood finance because of the whole financial journalism thing. It was slightly ludicrous. Anyway, it was supposed to be a romantic comedy. Well, so I wrote this romantic comedy.
Do you feel you're both a funny and romantic person?
I'm neither. I'm definitely not romantic. I don't think I'm very funny. So I did it, and it was fine. It didn't set the world on fire, but it didn't do terribly either. And then after that, they asked me to write a heartwarming Christmas romance.
How do you feel about Christmas?
I'm actually not very pro-Christmas. I've never been a very Christmassy person either. So I wrote 4 novels in that vein, but they did, for example, in the Christmas romance, there was somebody killed in a car accident on Christmas Eve. So I know, it's awful. So
they're putting the stockings up, they hear the crash outside the house.
I kept introducing more and more jeopardy into the books, and more terrible things kept happening to all the characters. And it was very obvious that there was a disconnect between what the publishers wanted from me and what I actually was interested in writing. And eventually, this told, and the 4th novel I wrote did very badly, and that was a bit of a disaster because it had taken me a while to write it, and it just sank without trace. And so then I was broke and felt a complete failure and everything was a disaster.
When you say broke, how broke?
I mean, I say broke. I was struggling to pay the mortgage. I did have to ask my father for help at one point, and that's embarrassing when you're 40. It really is. And I felt terrible about that. My parents don't have lots of money. It was pathetic. I felt utterly ashamed of myself. I'd run out of credit card debts. I was in a mess. And
where were you living at the time?
In London, in Brixton, in South London. And so I was pretty much ready to throw in the towel. I think I felt awful. And I was fortunate, though, that my agent, with whom I had talked about ideas for crime novels, she was very encouraging to me. She kept encouraging me. She was saying, yeah, go write that thing, press ahead with that. So my agent said, I'd come up with this idea for this drunk woman, this drunk girl, actually, is how I referred to her. So it's this person who drinks too much and can't remember what she did last night, and I'd been sort of trying to figure out how I could tell a story about her. And my agent said, that drunk girl is great. You've got to go back to her. That's a really good character. You could do something with her. And so in my despair, I started writing about the drunk girl. And I decided that what I would do was combine that idea, that character anyway, with this slightly vaguely rear window-ish thing I'd thought about where the initial idea was that she was going to witness an act of violence. But then I thought, well, actually she didn't have to witness an act of violence because of who she is, because she's this fantasist. She could witness anything and make it into something. And so there you go, drunk girl became Rachel, and she was on the train, and that became the girl on the train.
Do you remember the first sentence you wrote of this manuscript? Or where you were?
I don't, but I think it probably is the first. It might not be that there's I think now a little prologue-y bit, but I think it probably was something like that first chapter of the book, because I knew once I knew what I was going to do with her, and I realized that, oh yes, I know. Once I started writing in her voice, I was like, oh, yeah, this is right. This is much more like it. I can do this. I know, I knew her, and I knew what I wanted to do with her. So I don't think the first bit of the novel changed very much at all. There were lots of things changed about the plot at the end. I had to fiddle around with that a lot. But I think that the first section of that novel, which I wrote really quite fast once I knew what I was doing, that didn't change a lot, I don't think.
That's what you sold. You wrote like 40,000 words and sold the first chunk of it in 2013, maybe?
Yeah, so I literally couldn't afford to wait until I'd finished. So I said to my agent, can you try and sell it even though it's not finished? And she said, well, it's not a great idea because, you'll get more money if you finish it. And I was like, I don't have time to finish it. Just if you get anything you can. And she came back immediately and was like, oh, this is, we've got 4 publishers already interested. And that was one of those amazing situations where there was a little bidding war, and suddenly it was the most extraordinary relief that I knew then that it was going to be okay. In that moment it was.
What do you think you would have done had it not sold?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I don't like to think about it. I was in a bad place.
Mm-hmm. Did you pay your parents back?
I did.
Yeah, good.
I did. That was one of the first things I did when I got a deal. It probably was the first thing, was I rang my dad. And I can't talk about it because it makes me emotional to think about it.
That must have been great, though.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that story because it's an origin story.
Yeah, it is.
About a novel now which has become iconic in American letters and also internationally. It's interesting. And I know that you have you'll take a character and a location and think about them, maybe for a long, long time, and try to put them together. You said something interesting. We were talking earlier today. By the way, Paula Hawkins dedicated part of her day to speaking to the North Ed students of the Writers Studio here in Traverse City, Michigan. And
They were great. They had really good questions. They were brilliant.
And it really was a fantastic class, and thank you again. But during that, I'm listening in the back, and you said something so interesting about how they were asking you about research. And do you think you're a good researcher? And two, you read something about a dinner party that went wrong with a mushroom.
Oh, yeah.
And you kind of went off on a thing about how you tell the students how this might lead to something. So go ahead and explain that to the audience.
The mushroom bit?
Yeah.
I think I was talking about where story comes from. I think there was a question about true crime and whether I take stories from true crime, that kind of thing. And I was talking about what I tend to do is I'll read something in the newspaper or see something on television or whatever, and there'll be one little bit of it that strikes me, and I think, God, that's weird. And then I almost don't want to read the rest of the story because I just want to take that bit and make it my own and think about where I think it would have gone or how these people got to this point. And because of the books I write are not, spies or serial killers, it does tend to be just ordinary people whose lives have gone off track. The stories that tend to attract my attention are those kind of stories. And so there was a story, I think it was last year, it might have been the year before, about this woman in Australia who invited her ex-husband and his parents round for lunch and then fed them a beef Wellington that was made with death cap mushrooms. And I think the ex-husband couldn't make it or something, but she killed her parents-in-law. And I was so like, what? How did she think she was going to get away with that? And how did she get to that point? How on earth does some ordinary Australian woman, and I don't know anything about her, now, as I say, I didn't really look at it anymore, but you do think, like, what on earth was going on there that she'd got to that point that she thought, this is the way forward? And it's a horrible way to kill somebody. It's a dreadful way to die of that kind of poisoning. So yeah, anyway, so that's the kind of thing that I like, that really attracts my attention. And then I have to think about it for ages. And then, at some point someone will probably die by mushroom in one of my books.
Tell me, there's a photo on your Instagram page, which is lovely, by the way, if you, I recommend people go there, of your mother, I believe, sitting with the legs in a swimming pool with a yellow lab nearby. Tell me about that photo and when it was taken and your life. Do you remember?
I think that picture is probably about maybe 30 years old. So probably I was in my 20s and I'd gone back to Harare when I was still at university. I think it was one of those. And yeah, there's a really nice picture of my mum and she's got her feet in the pool and the dog next to her. The dog was probably, wouldn't have been Paddington. It might have been Odie. one of the many labs we had. Anyway, yeah, that was so. I used to go back to Harare every Christmas when I was younger. And then I stopped, I guess around the time of about the late 90s, early 2000s. And yeah, going back has seemed to be more difficult for me since then.
You explained to the students today that she would tell you stories.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder if this is a way into understanding the role of storytelling in how we cope. Yeah. And what kind of stories would she tell you? Yeah,
so my mum had a much, much more exciting African upbringing than I did. She was actually born in South Africa, but her parents split up, and her mum bought a farm in what was then Rhodesia. So this was like, I guess, in the late, how old was my mum? No, in the early 50s. And she and my mum were there on their own most of the time because my grandfather had stayed in South Africa and because my uncle, who was a bit older, had been sent away to boarding school. And it was frightening. They were, my grandmother, I never knew my grandmother, she died before I was born, but she was apparently a person who was frightened a lot of the time. So my mum had to kind of try and be the grown-up about it. And it was a time when things were starting to the war hadn't started yet because it wasn't UDI yet, but there were definitely rumblings of things that were, things were not good in Rhodesia. A neighbor was murdered. There were like horrible things happening. And so I think, and she used to tell me these kind of stories, and I found them fascinating. I found them thrilling. And I think it was partly because I had such a nice, safe childhood that it was comfortable for me to look at these things and find them thrilling. But yeah, she had all sorts of exciting things happen to her, the kind of, African childhood you're supposed to have, which I didn't. But, so her father was, for a while, he was a warden at one of the game reserves, and, she was charged by a rhino and had to climb a tree and all those kind of exciting things that ought to happen to you in your African childhood. But so she is a good storyteller.
Mm-hmm. There's a picture also, I think it might be on Instagram, of you and your partner in Death Valley in 2017. Have you been to the United States a lot on book tours? And does crime carry across borders? I mean, is there British crime and American crime?
I think I was so surprised by how well The Girl on the Train did here, because I had thought of it as the slightly quiet, slightly depressing story about a British alcoholic traveling on the train. I didn't really think that would, do so well, and yet it did do really well here. And I think there is the voyeurism at the heart of that story, and there are lots of other things that do travel really well. You don't have to be taking a train journey to find that thing of looking through people's windows and imagining yourself into other lives. That is kind of universal, and it did travel really well. So yeah, I have traveled quite a bit in the US. I think that Death Valley picture, that wasn't actually part of a book tour. My partner and I just decided to spend 3 months driving. We had kind of a weird circuitous. We started in Utah and went Arizona, and then ran sort of backwards and forwards a bit, and then California and up the West Coast. We had an amazing time. But so I have done quite a lot of touring here. But the weird thing about The Girl on the Train is that it worked in Spain, it worked in Italy, it worked in South America, where apparently a lot of crime doesn't work that well, particularly police procedural crime, because the police are not trusted. They're always seen as corrupt. So holding a police officer up as a hero doesn't work, apparently, in some cultures, the way it does, used to maybe in ours.
What do you think of heroes in fiction?
Well, I don't tend to have them. I don't tend to have heroes. I do tend to think that the most interesting characters are the ones where people can be more than one thing. That's the thing I find it. They may have heroic moments. They have moments where they do extraordinarily good things, and moments where they do bad things too, or less good. I think that those are the things. I don't find people who are purely good very interesting, because I don't think you encounter them very often. Maybe that's just me being really cynical and misanthropic. But I do also think that's kind of honest.
The lack of not liking heroes, I'm not quite sure I understand. What was missing?
I don't think, the idea that I don't think there are heroes, really. I mean, obviously, there are people who do heroic things, but I think to see people, a person as heroic is usually incredibly simplistic.
But you've told me also you like war novels. And there is a sense of heroism rising above the moment in those books.
There is that sense of doing a heroic thing, or at least a thing in which you sacrifice yourself. But then that's not to say that those people are good in every other way, or are good when they get home, or have always treated the people around them well. There are moments of heroism. I definitely believe in that. I definitely believe, we know for a fact people do extraordinary things to help others or to save others. But that doesn't mean that they are a hero in all parts of their life. I guess that's the thing I'm getting at.
I agree. That's interesting. I mean, I think the very definition of hero is you're not good in other parts of your life. And you
Is
do
it?
this one good thing when
Okay.
no one is looking, especially,
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah. But this brings me to the point and the realization reading your books is that you really are writing crime novels, but they're really about the psychology of people in all their complexity. I'm reading The Blue Hour, and I'm turning the pages, getting to the end, hoping that certain things turn out. And I'm thinking, wow, this is a really interesting experience I'm having, psychologically and kind of both narratively. And I think it's very hard to do. I'm sure it's very hard to do. You don't sit and plot a lot. Like, you don't stew over note cards and twists necessarily. And I'm just wondering how you trust yourself to move ahead.
Well, I do need to have a point to aim for. So I tend to know, I have one point that I'm aiming for. It tends to be the whodunit. So I know who did the bad thing. But what I find interesting is to leave everything else unplanned. Because although I may know one or two of the characters really well, I don't know everyone really well. And I do think you have to write yourself into a novel. And then you start to see connections between people, and ideas start to recur, and you start to see themes emerging, or maybe not themes, that sounds a bit grandiose, but certainly ideas that link to each other. And that's where it becomes really interesting, and you can spot the places where you can make the reader look in that direction while you do something else over here, and all those, but those things for me, I can't plan from the outset. I have to, they occur, it feels almost organically while I'm writing the book. And then about halfway through, there'll be a point where I have to stop and take a step back, because I then need to get a sense of the shape of the whole novel. Not, so there's that feeling of drawing back from it, so you can see how everything's starting to tie together, and you can see whether your rhythm is right, and whether, you want the pace to sort of, or the tension at least, to build up and then slacken and build and slacken. So you give people a chance to take a breath sometimes.
Do you have readers that you send to? No.
I mean, my agent.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll show my editors. I have more than one. Well, I have British and American, so it depends. Sometimes I show them a work early on. But I'm not one of those people who shows their husband or whatever, because I don't understand people who do that. What's he going to say, really? Great.
It's great.
Yeah. So that's meaningless, isn't it? He can't say anything but, yeah, brilliant.
Well, that's...
I know, like Ian Rankin, the Scottish crime writer, his wife is always his first read. How are they still married? It's crazy.
I forgot what I was going to say. I was trying to think about whether or not I should show my pages to Anne. Things have been going okay. I guess it probably would work out. This is a miscellaneous thought that I had. Where were you on 9/11?
I was in London.
And what was that like for you as a writer and as a person? I've been thinking about this lately.
Well, it was so... it was so extraordinarily shocking. I remember, like everybody, you heard that there's been this accident, and then it became clear that it wasn't an accident. And I think I must have had the radio on at that point. I turned on the television, and then because it was the middle of the day in the UK. I was working at home. I was freelancing then. And then obviously everybody sat there and watched it unfold.
Did you have the urge to put something like that into a novel? Or maybe you have and I've missed it, but world events, politics.
I'm nervous about putting politics into novels in a very overt sense. I think there's maybe some political stuff in the obviously you can probably tell the way I write about people and the way I might or for example women, that you can tell that I lean a certain way or what have you. But I think to do politics well in a novel is tricky. To do it in a way that doesn't feel like, now let me tell you what I think about this particular issue, which I don't think anyone really wants that in a novel. But there are novelists who do it, who I do think do it well. I'm reading Attica Locke at the moment. Yeah, who's an American crime writer, and I think she does politics pretty well. I mean, it's pretty explicit. It's out there. I mean, I don't mean explicit as in, but I mean she's directly addressing issues of race and politics in Texas in recent memory. And I think she does it very well. Yeah, but I don't think that's easy to do.
S.A. Cosby is another writer who's doing it very well. It's interesting. Is this a British thing that you don't, I mean, give us a primer on the audience here, this American audience, about what British crime writing is like or characterized as.
Well, it's such a broad, I think it is such a broad genre. It encompasses so many things. So you have everything from, some of you might know, we were talking about Mick Herron, who writes spy thrillers. There's Slow Horses series. There's a Apple TV series now at the moment. So those have a lot of politics in them. I mean, it's satire, really. But there's a lot about political corruption. So you have that. You have sort of very gritty, grittier novels by people like Ian Rankin or there's a Manchester crime writer whose name's gone out of my head. So, Joseph Knox. So that's, you have that kind of thing. You had a lot of sort of psychological thrillers written by women. So I think there's a huge range of different kinds of crime. And obviously, though, I'm forgetting the one that's the thing that everyone reads now, which is Cozy Crime with Richard Osman and the like.
Say that again.
Cozy Crime.
Cozy Crime. What is Cozy Crime?
Is Richard Osman not big here?
Who? What?
Richard Osman.
He's not been here. Do you know him?
I mean, I know him a little bit, but you know what I mean. So it's like, it's crime, but it's kind of quite jolly.
This doesn't seem your thing. You don't like Christmas.
No, I mean, I think he's great. I think he's really funny, but I couldn't do. I don't do.
You've told me that you like Richard.
I don't do jolly in my crime novels, but
you don't like Christmas. I don't think you're going to like a cozy crime.
But that's huge at the moment, and you notice that there's lots of people now sort of, you have these fashions, don't you? Like when Gone Girl came out and The Girl on the Train, and then suddenly there was a lot of that, like domestic noir, marriage, relationship kind of stuff. Suddenly every agent and every publisher starts looking for something that's in that vein. Sorry, I'm going croaky, I've been talking too much. I think you have fashions, don't you?
Fashions? Yeah. You said earlier that when you talk, you sound like a posh British person, but you're not, you said. Mm-hmm. Who are you then, if you were to describe yourself?
Oh, that is such
a hard question.
Yeah, that's that's such a mean question. But then that's maybe, there you go, with my identity issue, that it depends, it sort of probably depends who I'm talking to, and, well, I'm talking to you, but and in what circumstance, if you ask me, yeah. But I can't just sit here and define myself right now. I mean, I even struggle with, like, am I a crime writer? I mean, I suppose I am, but what I write doesn't necessarily fit neatly into the genre.
No, you're a fan of Pat Barker. You're a fan of writers, you say, who are literary writers who have a twist of. Well, I don't want to use the word twist. How do you feel about the word twist?
I mean, I think I like a good twist. I do like a good twist, but I think the reliance on twists in crime fiction has been overdone, or the need for, like, oh, it's so twisty and you'll never guess the twist at the end and all that kind of stuff. It becomes forced, it becomes contrived, it's not interesting, it's not earned. I think, you want all the groundwork to have been laid. If you're going to do something where suddenly you kind of pull the rug and the reader has to look back, you need them to be able to see that this has been coming all along. If they've been paying close attention, it has been coming all along. And I think there's too many things where it's you're just blindsided by some new piece of information which has just come out of nowhere. That isn't clever. I don't think that's not so interesting. And it's, we talk about twists in crime fiction, but they occur in other novels as well. I just read a really good novel called The Safekeep, which is, set in Holland just after the war, and you see the action through this one. It's just a literary novel, but it's not a crime novel. You see the action through one character's perspective, and then towards the sort of this last third, you see kind of the same stuff, but from a different perspective, and it's extraordinary because you suddenly can see everything clearly, whereas before it was like you were seeing it through frosted glass, and that is a good twist. Suddenly it all makes perfect sense, this slightly strange situation. So that's very clever.
We're going to go to questions here in just a moment. Thank you. What you've just said, though, I've wondered why you've never written an espionage novel, because they are the ultimate shape shifters, the ultimate wolf and dog. And I wondered if you were ever a fan of Jean le Carré or read that kind of stuff.
I mean, I really love the Smiley novels. And I love them for that. They're so sad, and it's also shabby and unglamorous. I love that about them. They're so anti-Bond. Everyone is, it's kind of all awful, and everyone's compromised, and it's just, but they really evoke the kind of seediness of 1960s Britain. Well, I mean, I wasn't around, so I don't know, but I imagine it was pretty seedy. But I think they're wonderful novels. They really are. But the sort of lack of glamour, I was talking earlier about how you can say anything in a spy novel because nobody really knows what spying is like. But I think you do have to have a particular sort of imagination. And also, what is spying like now? I mean, maybe I could write a historical spy novel, but I think now it's very techie, isn't it? And I don't have a techie brain, so, and I don't want to write about technology.
Well, yeah, you could go the other way,
I'd have to go historical.
Yeah, I mean, the first lecture you hear when you are a student at the agency in Virginia is they sit you down in a room and they say, literally, they say to you, everything you hear from now on could be a lie, and from now on you can trust nothing.
Wow. I mean, it is great.
That seems like right up your alley. I mean,
Right. Wow.
Thank you, Paula, so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
If we could bring up the lights. We have some microphones in the audience here. If you ask away with your questions, I'll point to you. Or just please come up to the microphone. Don't be shy. Yes. Would you mind going over there just so we have it amplified? Thank you.
Hi. I was thinking about this as you were talking, that I want to go back and read that book, The Girl on the Train. I remember reading it when it first came out, and you then mentioned Gone Girl with your, and I remember reading it at the time thinking about the unreliable narrator. And you just mentioned, everything that you've heard now is a lie. And so the way you were talking about that novel makes me want to go read it in a different vein now. But I'm just curious at your perspective on the unreliable narrator.
The hill I will die on is that all narration is essentially unreliable. I think even if people really want to tell the truth, nobody remembers things perfectly. So to some degree, we all tell a slightly different story about the same event. So to some degree, we all have to be. I mean, that's just subjectivity. But there are obviously degrees of unreliable narrator, and Rachel and the Girl on the Train was more... I mean, she was kind of unusual because she wasn't setting out to deceive. She literally didn't know because she couldn't remember, because she was a blackout drunk. So she was different to Amy in Gone Girl, who was definitely setting out to deceive. I think, again, it's a device, isn't it, having that very unreliable narrator, and it can work well if there's a reason for it. You need to have a good reason for it. But on the other end of the scale, I think that most people tell stories about themselves. You have to make life make sense. So you kind of, you cut corners and you shave off the edges and that kind of thing. So everyone's essentially unreliable.
Thank you. Interesting answer. Yes, hi, Joel.
Hi, this is a question from our virtual audience. After the US, are you going on a global tour?
I have been on tour in the UK and Italy. When I get back to Europe, I will do Spain, Portugal, and Germany, I believe. And then next year there is talk of a South American tour, but that is as yet unconfirmed. I'm sure there will be other places too. Well, I hope there'll be other places too. So it's not all organized yet, and it probably depends on how well the book does. So buy the book if you want to see me.
Could you have imagined this 9 years ago when you were just publishing Girl on the Train and
No.
paying your father back? And
Absolutely not. No. It's been obviously, aside from paying off credit cards and my dad, the really wonderful thing about having a big success like that is the fact that you suddenly get invited everywhere and you get to go to all these festivals all over the world. I went to Sydney and Vancouver and some to Brazil, to all sorts of places, and you meet you meet other writers and you have these amazing conversations, and that's the really wonderful stuff.
someone else with a question. If you can't get to the mic, you can shout it out. Here we come.
I so enjoyed you reading from your book. So my question is, will there be an audiobook, and will you read that?
There is an audiobook, but it is not read by me. It's read by an actor called Gemma Whelan, who you will recognize if you watch Game of Thrones. I mean, well, obviously you won't recognize her because it's only her voice. But anyway, she does a really lovely job of reading it. I think reading an audiobook it's a really difficult thing to do well. I'm quite happy doing these little bits, but spending days and days and days and days in a studio reading your own words would probably be a bit much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Someone else. I wondered when you don't show your work to somebody else, do you revise a lot? I mean, I've talked with writers and the answer is all over the place. I'm just curious about you. I
do revise a lot. I mean, it also depends, every book is different, to be honest. And this book, I loved writing this book. It was such a joy. And the plot all seemed to kind of work itself out quite nicely without too much tinkering around, which meant I had loads of time to just refine the language and spend ages looking at the sentences. And I did read it aloud because I think when you read something aloud, you start to notice the false notes. You know, you need to actually hear it to realize, oh no, that word doesn't sound right there. And oh no, she wouldn't say it like that. And that kind of stuff. So the two novels prior to this, I spent so long with the plot, I had just run out of time, and I don't think I had the same luxury of just really making sure that the words were right. So this was really nice to write, but it's not always the same process. You know, so sometimes it just... Was
the joy in the composition or the characters? I don't know if we've done justice to the world that is this book, and I think it is a fascinating world of art and mystery, and it takes place on an island, and you can only get to the island like every 12 hours? No.
Well, it's tidal, so when the tide is out, you can cross the causeway. When the tide is in...
But what's the causeway? A
causeway is just like a little spit of land. These islands, you get them in places, so it's a little raised bit that you can cross. But when the tide comes in, it's submerged. So there are lots of these little islands around. I mean, I'm sure you have them in the US as well. But it means you have to be careful when you're crossing, because if you get caught by the tide, it can be quite dangerous depending on where you are and how fast the tide is moving. But obviously it also means that your life, if you lived on an island like this, is sort of dictated by the tide. And obviously the tide moves slightly every, so it's different times of night and day. I was really fascinated by that idea of what it would be like to have your sort of movements and your life dictated by some element instead of...
It's fascinating, yeah. And it serves it ratchets up the tension in a number of places, so very
it does.
nicely.
It had that great thing where it's good for the plot, but it also helps shape the characters, because you also start to wonder what you would be like if you lived like that for ages, what it would do to you as a person, how you would start to change if you were kind of governed by the moon.
Yes, over here.
I was wondering if you stayed on a Scottish island as research, and did you stay alone?
I have stayed on many Scottish islands, never alone, actually. I'm a wimp. I would be terrified. The thing about me is I love the idea of buying some house in some incredibly isolated place and escaping everybody. But even with someone there, I would never sleep. I'd just be like listening for the creak on the stair. So it is complete fantasy. But no, I have a place in Edinburgh, and my partner and I go out to the West Coast quite a lot, and so I spent ages sort of walking there and taking loads and loads of photographs and making notes and imagining. I didn't use a real island because I wanted to be able to sort of move things around and make it exactly how I wanted. But the landscape and the feel of the place is very much inspired by real places on the West Coast.
And yes, go right ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Maria, and I recently moved to the USA. I'm Ukrainian, and it was very interesting to hear that you were in my country in the 90s. I think maybe I wasn't even born back then when you were there, so it was interesting to hear about it. And before I moved here in Ukraine, I taught English to Ukrainians, and we actually used your book, A Girl on the Train, and we used the abridged version, so it is adapted to the level, so the students could read with more comfort. So I was wondering what it feels like to be an author and to know that your book has been translated into many, many languages and that people actually use your book to learn English, yeah? And I remember looking at my students and how they would, syllable by syllable, they would learn new words and learn the patterns. And also maybe you have tried learning a different language, so what do you feel about it?
That's great to hear, thank you. It's a strange thing to have your work translated into so many languages. I think there's something I think there were 45 translations of The Girl on the Train, so it really did go everywhere. And I can't read any other languages apart from French. And so there's this weird sort of, you just have to trust that they're good translations. You have no idea. You have to trust your publishers. But yeah, there are literally, I have a couple of copies of all of them at home, and it's an extraordinary thing to see them all. And it's really great to hear that it was useful to your students.
Yeah.
I'm so glad.
Thank you.
Well, this brings, yes, oh, there you go.
I'll just kind of squat a little bit for this one. I'm just wondering, what kind of inspiration do you draw from, not necessarily music, but just from sounds, just from the natural environment, or just being living in a city, or possibly music?
That is interesting because I like to work in silence. I'm not one of those people who can write with music. And my partner, who now is at home all the time, he's retired, and he listens to music all the time. So this is a kind of point of contention that either he has to wear headphones or I have to wear headphones. So, but no, for me to concentrate, I do like silence. I can, at the outside work with a bit of classical music, nothing with anything lyrical, because I just find the lyrics immediately are in my head, and I find it distracting. So yeah, it's one of the things that's one of the reasons, I want to escape to my fictional island, is for the peace. The sound of the sea I could do. The sound of the sea would be fine, but apart from that, nothing.
And lastly, the title. Why is it called The Blue Hour? We opened with this conversation, but I don't think we figured out why it's called The Blue Hour.
Well, it had another title, and the publishers didn't like it, so no. But it's actually a really lovely title for it. It is all about perception. It is all about misperception, and seeing one thing and actually encountering another. And so, and I think it is about, there are also several key things that happen at that time, at that moment at which energy is shifting and and predators are moving around. So it fit in a number of ways, and it's a nice lyrical, arty kind of title. But it does speak to the issues around perception and misperception.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. It's been terrific.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you for joining us. Up
And
next
we'll see you
is
again.
True crime author Aphrodite Jones, Thursday, November 7th. Get in-person and virtual tickets at nationalwriterseries.org.